With that, it's my pleasure to bring up Ethan Weissman from CoStar.
Thank you, Stockton, and thank you, NAAHL, for having me today. So my presentation, the next few slides, 15 minutes or so, is set to introduce the panel, provide some context for naturally occurring affordable housing, really delve into identifying and analyzing it at sort of the 30,000-foot level. So let's see if this clicker works. All right, great. So to begin, where do we start? Well, let's take a look at the renter landscape just from the high view. So this is, according to CoStar, what rental housing inventory looks like in the United States. The blue slice is actually census data. We don't track non-multifamily properties, but actually constitutes the majority of rental units in the country. However, what CoStar does focus on is the orange and the red, your rent subsidized and your market rate properties across the country. Naturally occurring affordable housing will fall within that orange section, right? Your market rate and your market/affordable, which we lump in your properties where units are set aside, at least some of them, for affordable housing, similar to an 80-20 building. And so you can see that within this segment, there's about 16 million units. And then within that, we wanted to find what naturally occurring affordable housing is, obviously. And so we actually took a bit of a novel approach. Our firm ranks properties based on quality from a 1 to 5 scale. It's our star rating system. And so we basically said, well, this is a very good proxy for what would be considered affordable. If you took maybe sort of the bottom third of this sort of quality spectrum, and you could get a good approximation for affordable. And so if we do that and look at just 1 and 2 star properties, right, we're looking about over 5 million units across the country, about 13% of all rental inventory. And so to Stockton's point, that is a significant part of the whole rental landscape. And so just to provide some context with our star rating system, we have here what is considered 1 and 2 star. This is going to be your sort of basic housing with not a lot of amenities, either in the unit or on property. And in addition, you may have had not a ton of capital improvements and maybe sort of older in vintage. Tends to be sort of your most basic level of housing. So conversely, you have, when you go up the quality spectrum, your 3-star properties. That's actually the largest segment. And these are going to be your run-of-the-mill, maybe 20 or 30-year-old properties, largely built in the 80s. They'll have a little bit better, nicer in-unit amenities, and then maybe things like a pool, in-unit laundry, and such things like that, which will sort of add to that quality. And then on the top end of the market, very quickly, you've got your 4-star and your 5-star. At minimum, basically your new housing is coming in at this level, right? At the top end, in the 5-star, you'll have your stainless steel appliances and granite countertops, and then maybe a step below that if it's a 3-star or 2-star building that's maybe been renovated or again built to a slightly lower qualities. So given this quality, and here's just a nice little visual in terms of just to provide a frame of reference here. So you can see at the top, this is what we're talking about when we're talking about 1 and 2-star, versus all the way down your 5-star, your brand new, beautiful glass towers in the middle of downtown. So to prove out that we actually were sort of on the right track in terms of using this star rating system, we took a look at rents actually in this space, especially as a percentage of inventory. And we'll get into the sort of rents in a little bit more detail later on. But I think this does a really good job of showing that 1 and 2-star actually is, for the most part, a pretty good definition or a proxy for naturally occurring affordable housing. You see the red line here, all the way to the right. Rents are about 16.5% of income if you take that 30% number, which I guess there is some controversy today about. Whereas when you look at the top end of the market, your 4 and 5-star, which is most like Class A, you're looking at over 25%, 26% of income. In addition, I think the second really interesting point here, and why we're here today really, is the slowly but steadily increasing line, right? In every rent segment, regardless of quality, even over the past 3 years, you're seeing an erosion of affordability. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. So this is the breakdown in terms of star rating. So we're in the market rate universe, right? How much of that is actually 1 and 2 star versus the other types? And so again, you can see that more than a third of all units are this 1 and 2 star of this 1 and 2 star variety. Now, the biggest slice again is 3 star, but when you talk about 5.5 million units, right? That's about what people think to be sort of the amount of subsidized housing in United States. So any conversation that involves affordable housing has to include this as well as of course, your subsidized housing. This is from a unit count perspective. From a building count perspective, it actually gets a lot more interesting. Quite a difference, right? 75% of all buildings, at least in our inventory of almost 400,000 across the country, are considered 1 and 2 star. And so you get the idea here that these buildings tend to be a little bit smaller, right? And we'll delve into that as well. But this inventory truly is across the country. We've got about 900 CBSAs on this chart, I think. And there are 1 and 2 star units in pretty much all of them. I think the stat is 98 metros with at least 10,000 1 and 2 star units. Of course, you can see that from the size of the bubbles that they are concentrated somewhat, right? Your core coastal metros in the Northeast as well as in California have a large percentage of inventory. New York and LA, no surprise there, are the top 2. And the top 10 metros account for about 40% of all inventory. So while it is fairly concentrated, you're talking about a lot of secondary and tertiary metros that contain a lot of these units. So there's opportunity in this space really everywhere. From a building count perspective, the distribution is a little bit more narrow, right? LA actually has the most 1 and 2 star properties in the country, about 45,000 of them. And next in line comes New York, even though New York actually has slightly more units. So again, this goes to the building size component here. And the top 10 metros account for over 50% of all buildings. So it's a little bit more of a concentration from an asset level. So judging by my sort of commentary over the past couple of slides, it should come as no surprise that when you're talking about the non-institutional quality or non-institutional size buildings, anything maybe less than 20 units, right? That's going to be a lot of 1 and 2 star product, and in fact it is, right? All the way to the left, you see those red bars towering over the other 2. But that does not necessarily mean that there aren't any buildings, of size in the space, right? 30% of all units in the 1 and 2 star space are in buildings of 100 units or more, and it's 60% if you go down to the 20 or 20 plus, right? So again, you have your mom and pops who may own a 10-unit walk-up in New York, but of course there's institutional quality type of assets here as well. Another way to look at this is actually the age of the properties. As I mentioned before, these tend to be a little bit on the older side. In fact, if you take the 60s and 70s, that accounts for over half of all 1 and 2 star units around the country. And then to Stockton's earlier point, if you look all the way to the right, we see that you don't really build this type of inventory, right? Just by sheer sort of quality of new construction, it's going to come in at a bare minimum 3 star, and most likely, or the vast majority of them are going to be your 4 and 5 star. So really, anytime you have any sort of supply growth in this segment, it's going to come from the sort of natural life cycle of a property as it slowly degrades, in terms of its timeline. And of course, that can be interrupted by capital improvements, value-add strategies taken on by the landlord, or simply demolition as resulting in redevelopment, right? And so when you talk about the housing stock, it is very stagnant in terms of its size. And so that has an enormous impact when we look at fundamentals. So this chart shows vacancy rates over the past 3 years by star rating. I think the biggest thing to note here is that while the 4 and 5 star product, which all the new construction is affecting, is increasing, and where we're seeing a lot of the rise in vacancies, the rest of the market has actually continued to see a decline, right? So even your B-class properties, that orange line, is showing a steady decline over the past few years. And with all those new renters coming into the market, and without the supply to sort of alleviate some of that pressure, there's no reason why these tight vacancies shouldn't remain this way, for the foreseeable future. And that certainly has had an impact on rents. So if you look at rent growth, right, you can see that the dark columns represent long-term over the past 3 years or so, I would say midterm, and then the lighter shade of column represents just year over year. And so I think the first point here is that despite the fact that this may be lower quality housing, it's not as if landlords can't raise rents, right? We're talking about a 5% increase on average since the beginning of 2013. On top of that, while you look on the right, while 4- and 5-star product has been affected by that increase in vacancy, right? Lease-up's taking a little bit longer now that there's been a lot of supply. DC is a great example of a market. As you're driving down to Reagan, pass by the Navy Yard area, you can just see how many cranes are out there. It's been seriously affected, right? However, the low volatility in the 1- and 2-star segment is actually quite impressive in that, the drop-off in rents as we've already sort of hit peak rent growth for this cycle, hasn't really been that significant. So just a couple more slides, and we'll turn over to the panel. So how does this affect, rent levels at the metro level? Well, it's actually quite varied, obviously. You have the top of the chart, San Francisco, which is a metro where even in the lowest quality buildings, right, you're asking about $2,500 in rent, which is quite a big sum. And a lot of these are going to be your core coastal, your tech markets, where you've seen that huge run up, maybe even double-digit, rent growth at some point this cycle. And then, of course, on the far side, you maybe have some of your slower growing, lagging metros from terms of an economic perspective, but still, quite a bit of variation. So how does, and the last thing I'm going to show is rent as a percentage of the market level, right? So for these 1- and 2-star rent levels, is it a deal? How expensive are they compared to the market average, right? So going back to these core coastal metros, you can see that for the most part, even with a run up in rent on the top end of the market, all these luxury product that is breaking rent per square foot records left and right, it's expensive everywhere no matter what, and you're really paying for the location over quality, right? So even in San Francisco, it's not about the shoebox you live in, it's about the land underneath it. Conversely, you can see that, a nice shade of green in the southeast, especially in Florida, where you show that divergence, right? Where you actually are showing relative affordability in this 1- and 2-star product.
So I am going to try to set the stage a little bit. Just really, some of this is going to be like, I knew that already. So I'll just fly through some of the mortgage market context. But I thought it would be good as a backdrop for the discussion to kind of cover a few different areas and try to answer a few questions. I'm going to start kind of with a high-level mortgage market stats and then talk a little bit about what the newly released HMDA data is showing us. And particularly for minority populations, I'm going to talk a little bit about the first-time homebuyer characteristics that we're seeing in the current market environment. And then I'm going to close with really the two biggest kind of looming challenges for the mortgage markets as we see them in the work that we do at the Urban Institute, which is the credit box, which has a lot of dimensions to it, and housing supply, which is a considerable constraint and issue right now that is of great concern going into the future. So this slide you've probably seen before. This is really about the value and the size of the U.S. housing market. The housing market itself is increasing. It's driven by growing household equity and total mortgage debt. Mortgage debt outstanding is over $10 trillion today, and household equity continues to increase. So homes are increasing in value at great stride at $13.4 trillion. Almost 60% of all mortgages are in agency MBS, so Fannie, Freddie, Ginnie, and you can see at the bottom of this chart that there are a great deal of private label securitizations and second liens that have sort of disappeared from the scene in the last 10 years. So I leave that context or lead with it just because we're talking about something sizable. I think that the last panel actually touched on this a little bit. It's a little bit more inertia here. There's a lot of things at stake. And as we all know, the economic factors of the housing market itself really do play a huge role in how things go overall in the U.S. economy. So this next page is really all about mortgage originations. First lien originations in the first 2 quarters of 2016 totaled $890 billion. The share of portfolio lending was almost 34%, and GSE share fell to 43%, losing some ground to FHA. And as you can see from the bottom chart here, private label securities, as I mentioned earlier, have just really disappeared from the mortgage market over the past 10 years since 2006. And lenders like their loans better these days. If you look at the yellow, I think it's yellow up there, hopefully, you can see that over the past 10 years, the increasing amount of mortgage loans that are being kept on portfolio at the lender shop, and that is because these loans are perfect. They're great loans. And so, one of the things that we talk about, or what I like to talk about when I look at this picture, is what's going on with credit. How the dynamics of what we saw in 2004 and 2006 with the blue that you see there, which was all the private label securitization, which meant more liquidity, different kinds of players, different kinds of products in the market, how all of that has disappeared. If you go to the far right and look at these, the later years after 2008, there's no more blue, and loans are on portfolio. The government has stepped in and is doing the majority of the lending, and that also means that product has changed. The product mix available has changed, and that's what we're seeing in terms of the shrinking credit markets. And I think it's really important to remember how important channel and product really are when we look at what's going on and when we think about tight credit and those kinds of things. The next thing I want to really get into a little bit is first-time home buyers, just because that's an important and emerging group or segment that's demanding access to mortgage credit. The share of GSE first-time home buyer continues to decline over time. FHA lending, actually, which has been more of a first-time home buyer focused product, was at about 82% in August, and that is down from its historic higher levels, but still strong in terms of first-time home buyer focus. The bottom table here is what I really want to focus on, which shows you that based on mortgages originated in August of 2016, the average first-time home buyer was more likely than an average repeat buyer to take out a smaller loan balance, have a lower credit score, and a higher LTV and DTI. But look at the first-time home buyer scores on this chart. I just think it's a really telling fact. Again, it's another view that just emphasizes that lending is happening in the highest tiers of the credit spectrum for most borrowers. The average LTVs on first-time home buyers also tell us something about how much low down payment product is actually getting take up in the marketplace. And it is, one of the largest obstacles to home buying is not only your credit, but it is your savings and your ability to supply or to have a down payment. So these are just areas that we're looking at, both borrower and product risk buckets that we focus on, that we're thinking about, and when we think about ways that we might be able to open up the credit box. But the first-time home buyer average credit score of 741 on the GSE book and 680 on the FHA book are just extremely high compared to what they were historically. Really quick HMDA view of things. The data on HMDA, which was released in September for 2015, this is just a distribution of what, we've looked at it every which way, but this is a race and ethnicity distribution that shows the trend of what's going on. One of the things I think it's important to look at here is HMDA is showing us one thing very clearly, and as we looked at the data, after you go through all of it and scrub it, when you look at things as far as race and ethnicity and income, it is complete stagnation in terms of what's gone on over the last 10 years. There's stagnation and decline in originations for minorities when reviewed by race and income. And for race and ethnicity, non-Hispanic white borrowers and Asians were the only group that saw an increase in origination activity over the past 10 years. So I think it's important. And on income, we saw, well, let me just go back to race and ethnicity. Whites going from 61% in 2006 to 68% in 2015. Asians going from 5 to 6% on total originations. Everything else, it was in a decline mode. So I don't have the detailed slides on that, but I do want to mention that when you look at it by income, we just saw the greatest share of mortgages increased in the last 10 years for the highest income levels, those at 200% plus of LMI. So an important stat. This is just a distribution. This just shows you basically the total loan applications and originations that the HMDA data showed us, and you can just see from 2004, total applications are less than half at 28 million to 12 million. Total originations, 15 down to 7. So we're at 50% of the levels too. So we're doing a lot less lending. Overall, there's a lot less homeownership happening, and in certain pockets, those numbers are going down even more greatly. Yes.
Could you tell me how many units are involved in a HMDA reported multifamily loan?
I believe these are everything 5 plus, 5 units plus. Yes. 5 units plus.
Thank you.
So yeah, so that's the story on HMDA. It's not a great story, but it is what the data is telling us. Really quickly talking about access to credit. So mortgage credit availability has been an issue. We've talked about it kind of repeatedly. If you read any of the Urban Institute's work or Lori Goodman's work, we talk about credit access as one of the biggest barriers at this particular point in time, and it has been for some time. We've shown that the market is taking less than half the credit risk that it was taking in 2001, and we consider 2001 to be sort of a reasonable credit standard period. There are lots of reasons for this, including the fact that lenders often put overlays on top of FHA and GSE credit boxes because they're afraid of putbacks or rep and warrant risk. There's a high and uncertain cost for servicing that is really important to note, and really is playing probably more of a role than most people realize in the cost to originate a mortgage. And the access to credit is being hindered by the way the servicing structure is currently set up. There's a lot of fears around under the False Claim Acts for FHA lending, and so the FHA and GSEs have done a lot to try to get lenders more comfortable, but there's still a long way to go in terms of eliminating overlays and sort of removing those kinds of barriers from the market. Our center, our latest, we put out something called the Housing Credit Availability Index, which I have up on the screen. That shows that mortgage credit availability continued to go down in this last quarter. So things are still getting even tighter than where they've been, and we're waiting to see kind of that moment when things start to go in the other direction, but it's not so far. So mortgage credit's down at what we call 5.1 in the second quarter is a score that it has, and this means that lenders are still not making loans to thousands of people who pose little credit risk in the current environment. So in a normal environment, if you use 2001 to 2003 as a standard rational lending standard, a normal would be 12.5, and we're at 5.1. So the HCAI that we put together measures the percentage of home purchase loans that are likely to default, and that is basically they go 90 days plus past due. If there's a lower HCAI, it means that lenders are not willing to tolerate defaults and imposing tighter lending standards. We also I'll just put a side note out there because I think that other folks on the panel will talk about this, but if you look at this, it's broken down by product risk in blue and the borrower risk in gray, and we do believe that a lot more product risk can be taken if you look at not going back to anything that was being done during in subprime or anything predatory, but when you look at sort of products for low balance lending, small mortgage loans, rehabilitation type loans for our aging housing stock, shared equity models, new and different ways of lending. There's a lot of opportunity. We are taking no product risk. If you look at what's been going on since 2008 up until now in this chart, everything is really just 30-year plain vanilla or 15-year if you're refinanced. I mean, there's just not a whole lot else out there. And with the changing demographics of the borrowers that we have in the mix and in the market, we've really got to work hard on that to try to open up credit. Product mix definitely matters. I'll just go on to talk about what we call, we call this the default fingers chart because it looks like a lot of fingers. But I think the important thing here is today's mortgage borrowers, anyone who's taken out a mortgage really in the last 3 to 4 years, they're perfect. They're more perfect than anybody who's ever taken out a loan before them. It's off the charts perfection. And this chart really just sort of demonstrates that. I'll just explain it really quickly. But why are they perfect? Because Only the best borrowers are getting loans, and these loans are so thoroughly scrubbed and underwritten and meticulously documented. They are super clean loans, and nobody's defaulting. So all the loans that have been made in the last several years, there are just hardly any defaults on the scene, which tell us that there's something really special going on with this group of borrowers. The default fingers chart just shows us how the default rate is tracking well below mortgages that were originated between 1999 and 2003. I think the line is either red or pink there. We consider that sort of a normal period. That's when normal lending was going on, and default rates were still fairly low. The poor performance of 2006, 7, and 8, you can see those jump off the page at the top. Those are very, very high default times. 2009 and 2010 vintages are defaulting only marginally less than the 1993 to 2003 vintages. And then you'll see the 2011 vintages to current with 3 years of seasoning, there's nothing happening. You can barely see the line there at the bottom. I think it's blue or maybe green. The green line at the bottom. So you can see how far below the pink, which was normal times, we are in terms of what's going on from a default standpoint. And this is truly the story about what's going on with tight credit. I mean, we've got a lot of room to make some moves and open up the credit box in this space. So that is leading to this next slide, which is about what we call missing loans. So we just, after looking at the HMDA data, we have just reanalyzed the data to project that 1.1 missing loans are missing from 1.1 million loans are missing from the picture altogether. These are basically, if you look at 2009 to 2014, lenders failed to make about 5.2 million mortgages due to overly tight credit. In total, lenders could have originated 6.3 million additional mortgages between 2009 and 2015 had standards been more reasonable and consistent with what we consider historically normal. We calculated that what mortgage originations would have been if borrowers on all credit levels had the same access to the mortgage market in 2015 as they did in 2001. And this table shows that from 2001 to 15, the number of new purchase borrowers with FICO scores above 700 dropped 1.4% down to 2.32 million. And the number of new purchase borrowers declined 20% for borrowers with scores from 660 to 700, and 65% for borrowers with scores below 660. So we use that to calculate missing loans. Sorry, I could probably use some water, but I don't have any. The view of missing loans is basically very FICO driven, and there are other factors that are taking weight here. But I think I would just argue here that if you took other factors into consideration, other market factors into consideration, this is probably an underestimate. Because if you think about the fact that home prices have been lower and other factors beyond credit were in play, this is probably an understated number of people that could have gotten mortgages that did not. So one last note is going to be on supply. One of the most critical issues we're facing right now is the lack of housing supply overall. I think you're well aware that about the affordable supply deficit we face in the purchase and rental space. Since 2009, housing demand has outstripped supply quite significantly in some markets. In 2015, we estimated more than 1 million new households were created, but only 620,000 new housing units were completed, creating a shortage of a little over 430,000 units. This gap pushed up home prices and rents, a trend that we continue to see in the foreseeable future, absent any imminent policy changes. In 2008, we had more housing than was needed when we entered the economic crisis, putting downward pressure on prices. And then construction has really not kept up pace. And so now that surplus has pretty much been eliminated from the market. So in a world where housing infrastructure is getting older and inventory is lower because people aren't moving as frequently, the housing supply issues, and we have a growing population of people entering the market. We've got something that's fairly serious that needs to be addressed in the coming years to ensure that we kind of get control over the housing supply issues and also give some relief to rents because right now that pressure we're all seeing that in the unaffordability of rents at this point. So those
You have
are
a question.
Yeah.
I just wondered how all of this data around homeownership intersects with what we all hear anecdotally about millennials wanting to rent and all of this demand for rental housing in downtowns, and that's pushing people away from homeownership. So is some of this a natural flow of people to rental or not?
I think there is a natural need for rental. I think rental has a healthy and permanent spot in the picture in terms of what the overall housing market is and needs to be. I think the bigger problem that this really points to is the price of rental, the cost to rent, that is getting extremely high because people just don't have this option anymore of having a house to go buy, or so that's being prolonged. So I think it's not necessarily one or the other, but I do think that it's the issues of supply and on the housing homeownership side are definitely putting pressure on the rental markets. Yes.
Is that universally true across geographies, or is it it's not a coastal problem? It's a.
No, it's not universally true across geographies. I mean, there are definitely distinctions. Obviously, this is a national view of housing stock, but in certain cities, you're seeing a far different set of issues. And so, no, it's not universal. It's definitely in certain localities more of an issue or less of an issue. But I think what we're seeing fairly consistently nationally in a lot of markets is that rents are really skyrocketing in a lot of places.
If I may add, I don't know if Chris from Joint Center is still around. They have some interesting data where they track new household moving into home ownership with income growth. And if you look at the millennials, they match up historically with data on that. And it may just be correlation, not causation, but their income growth is lagging substantially. Mm-hmm. And if you correct for income growth, they're about where you would predict using historical figures on home ownership. So you get delay for a number of reasons, but polling shows millennials still have very similar, at least longer-term desires for home ownership. So those factors are obviously all in play as well.
Yeah. I mean, one of the big things with millennials that we're seeing is that they want to own homes. They're doing it a little bit later for a lot of different environmental reasons. They're just not buying homes as early as maybe many of us did in our lifetime. So that is definitely.
Yeah, sort of a follow-up to that is when you looked at the debt to income ratios, was there any further breakdown of proportion of student debt contributing to the overall ratio?
So I don't have all that data here. There's a tremendous amount of research that, as you probably many of you have probably seen over the last couple of years, and the Urban Institute's done a lot of it as well, around the impact of student loans really in this picture. Our position has really been that it's small in terms of the impact that student debt is really having on this. There are just so many other things at play when it comes to the credit box and the underwriting standards that's not as much of an issue. Where we're seeing the biggest concern where student loans are concerned is the income issue. Right. When someone hasn't finished their degree, they're maybe not getting a job, and now they have the debt, don't have the income to support. That's another story, and we see the issue much more pervasive there than kind of overall.